There are places in the world where history feels like a sequence, ordered, documented, unfolding in neat transitions from one era to the next. And then there are places like Ireland, where time does not so much move forward as it folds inward, where the past lingers in the landscape like a second atmosphere, where stone walls remember hands that placed them centuries ago, and where the boundaries between myth, memory, and recorded fact dissolve into something far more enduring than simple chronology, creating a kind of historical gravity that pulls every generation back toward the same enduring questions of identity, land, belonging, and power. Over the next 1,000 years, this island, small in size yet immense in narrative density, will experience cycles of fragmentation and unification, invasion and resistance, suppression and cultural resurgence, each century layering itself atop the last, not as a clean replacement, but as an accumulation, a sediment of human experience that never fully settles, beginning in a world of rival kings and oral tradition, moving through the arrival of foreign powers who will seek not only to rule, but to redefine the very structure of Irish society, passing through centuries marked by plantation, rebellion, famine, and diaspora, and eventually emerging into a modern nation still negotiating the echoes of everything that came before. This is not a story that can be told in straight lines, because Ireland itself does not move in straight lines. It loops, it fractures, it remembers, and it resists forgetting, carrying forward languages, songs, grievances, and identities that refuse to disappear even under sustained pressure, so that what begins as a collection of local kingdoms will, over centuries, become a contested territory within expanding empires, then a site of profound human tragedy during the Great Famine, then a crucible for revolution, and finally a nation divided and redefined in the aftermath of the Irish War of Independence and the subsequent partition that still shapes its political and cultural reality. And yet, even as political structures rise and fall, even as external powers impose systems and redraw boundaries, there remains something persistent beneath it all, a continuity of place and culture that absorbs change without fully surrendering to it. So that across these 10 segments, each representing a century, we will not simply observe events, but trace the deeper currents that bind them together, watching as Ireland transforms not once, but repeatedly, each transformation incomplete, each resolution temporary, each century leaving behind both answers and new uncertainties, until the present itself feels less like an endpoint and more like another moment suspended within an ongoing, unfinished story. Ireland at the opening of the second millennium does not present itself as a unified kingdom, nor even as a coherent political entity in the way later centuries would attempt to retroactively imagine it, but rather as a shifting, breathing tapestry of tuatha, small, fiercely independent kingdoms, layered one upon another like overlapping currents beneath a restless sea, each ruled by local kings who owed varying degrees of allegiance to overkings, and above them all the ever-contested title of High King of Ireland, a position less of absolute authority than of negotiated dominance, often centered at the ceremonial and symbolic heart of Hill of Tara, where myth and governance intertwined so tightly that one could not easily separate ritual sovereignty from political control, and where legitimacy was as much inherited from ancient memory as it was seized through force. Yet beneath this fragmented political surface, there existed a deeper continuity, a cultural cohesion woven through language, law, and belief, preserved and transmitted by the learned classes, the Fillid, poets, the Brehons, jurists, and the monastic scholars, whose influence extended far beyond any battlefield, maintaining the intricate legal system known as Brehon law and safeguarding genealogies that could stretch backward into semi-mythical time, while monasteries, scattered like quiet constellations across the island, functioned not merely as religious centers, but as engines of literacy, diplomacy, and economic activity, their scriptoria producing illuminated manuscripts in a world where the written word still held an almost sacred weight, even as the echoes of earlier Viking incursions lingered in coastal settlements that had begun, by this point, to transform from raiding outposts into thriving trade hubs. It is within this layered and unstable equilibrium that figures such as Brian Boru emerge, not as anomalies, but as expressions of a system constantly testing its own limits, his rise representing both the possibility and the impossibility of unity as he maneuvered through alliances, rivalries, and calculated displays of power to assert dominance over much of the island, culminating in the famous clash at the Battle of Clontarf, a conflict often mythologized as a decisive expulsion of Viking influence, though in truth it was far more entangled, involving Irish factions on both sides, and resulting in a paradoxical outcome where Brian's forces prevailed, but he himself fell, leaving behind not a consolidated kingdom, but a vacuum into which the old patterns of fragmentation swiftly reasserted themselves, as if the island itself resisted the imposition of singular rule. In the decades that followed, Ireland did not collapse so much as it resumed its natural state of dynamic imbalance, where power shifted like weather across regions, where kinship ties could both stabilize and destabilize entire territories, and where external influences, particularly from Norse Gaelic towns such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, continued to integrate into the fabric of Irish life, bringing with them not only trade networks that connected the island to the wider Irish sea world, but also subtle cultural transformations, as identities blurred and hybrid communities emerged, neither wholly native nor wholly foreign, but something new and quietly consequential. And so, as the year 1100 approaches, Ireland stands not at the end of an era, but at the edge of a transformation it does not yet perceive, its internal divisions intact, its cultural systems resilient yet vulnerable, its political structures both deeply rooted and fundamentally unstable, creating the precise conditions under which an external force, more centralized, more systematically expansionist, could eventually find both entry and opportunity, though for now the island remains self-contained, its rhythms governed by its own ancient logic, unaware that the centuries ahead will begin to press upon it with increasing intensity. If the Ireland of the previous century existed in a state of internally sustained imbalance, its rival kingdoms circling one another in a familiar choreography of alliance and conflict, then the 12th century begins as that same dance continues, only to be gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, disrupted by forces that do not belong to the island's inherited logic, forces that will not simply participate in its systems, but will begin, piece by piece, to overwrite them. And this shift does not arrive as a sudden invasion, but as a series of invitations, calculations, and unintended consequences rooted in the ambitions of Irish kings themselves, particularly figures like Diarmait mac Murchada, whose exile and subsequent quest to reclaim his throne would open a doorway that could never again be fully closed. Diarmait's appeal was not made to neighboring Irish rulers, who operated within a system that limited how far power could extend, but to forces beyond the Irish Sea, to the rising Anglo-Norman world, shaped in the aftermath of the Norman conquest of England, a world that had already demonstrated its capacity to impose centralized control over fragmented territories. And so, when he secured the backing of Norman lords, such as Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, the nature of Irish conflict began to change, because what landed on Irish shores in the late 1160s was not merely another competing faction, but a different model of power altogether. Heavily armored cavalry, castle-based occupation, and a feudal system that viewed land not as a fluid network of kinship claims, but as a commodity to be granted, seized, and permanently held. The arrival of these forces initially appeared limited, even containable, as Norman leaders established footholds in Leinster and surrounding regions, intermarrying, negotiating, and embedding themselves into the existing structure. But the deeper transformation became unavoidable when Henry II of England intervened directly in 1171, not merely to support Diarmait's cause, but to assert royal authority over the Norman adventurers themselves, marking the beginning of a new political layer imposed upon Ireland, one that would gradually evolve into the lordship of Ireland under English control, thereby integrating the island, partially, unevenly, and often violently, into a broader geopolitical system that extended far beyond its shores. Yet, even as this new order began to take shape, it did not erase what came before, and instead Ireland entered a state of dual existence, where Gaelic systems of kingship, law, and identity persisted alongside, and often in tension with, the encroaching Norman framework, creating a layered society in which boundaries were not always clear, where some Norman settlers adopted Irish customs and language, while certain Irish rulers engaged with feudal structures when it suited their ambitions, producing a complex, evolving frontier rather than a clean conquest, a frontier that would define the island for centuries to come, as zones of control expanded and contracted, as authority was claimed and contested, and as Ireland itself became, increasingly, a place shaped not only by its internal dynamics, but by its entanglement with external powers whose reach and intentions would only grow stronger in the centuries ahead. By the opening of the 13th century, Ireland exists not as a conquered land in any absolute sense, nor as the autonomous mosaic it once had been, but as something far more unstable and, in many ways, more complex, a layered territory in which the Anglo-Norman presence, once tentative and opportunistic, has begun to solidify into something resembling a governing framework, centered increasingly around administrative hubs such as Dublin, where authority is articulated not through ritual and lineage alone, but through charters, land grants, and an expanding network of castles that act both as military strongpoints and as instruments of economic control, while beyond these nodes of power the Gaelic world persists, adapting, resisting, and in many cases, absorbing the very forces that were meant to transform it. The initial decades of this century are marked by expansion, measured, deliberate, and often effective, as Anglo-Norman lords push outward from their established bases, constructing fortified landscapes that begin to redefine the geography of power itself. Yet this expansion is never total, never uncontested, because the deeper one moves into the island, the more the older systems reassert themselves, not in static opposition, but in dynamic adaptation, as Gaelic lords observe, learn, and selectively incorporate elements of Norman military and political organization, while some Norman families, over generations, begin to adopt Irish customs, language, and alliances, creating a blurred frontier where identity becomes less about origin and more about allegiance and survival, a phenomenon so pronounced that later authorities will attempt to halt it through measures like the Statutes of Kilkenny, though the seeds of that concern are already visible here in the quiet erosion of clear distinctions. And yet, even as cultural boundaries soften in some regions, political tensions sharpen in others, because the Anglo-Norman project in Ireland is not a unified endeavor, but a fragmented extension of competing interests, where powerful families carve out semi-independent territories, often acting with a degree of autonomy that complicates the authority of the English crown, while the crown itself, distant and intermittently engaged, struggles to impose consistent control over a land that resists simplification, leading to a pattern in which governance becomes reactive rather than directive, responding to crises rather than preventing them, and in doing so, allowing localized conflicts between Gaelic clans, between Norman lords, and increasingly between hybrid communities that belong fully to neither world, to shape the lived reality of the island. What emerges by the close of the 13th century, then, is not consolidation in the sense of stability, but consolidation in the sense of entanglement, a tightening of relationships, political, cultural, and economic, that binds the island into a more interconnected, yet more volatile system, where the distinctions between conqueror and native, ruler and subject, begin to lose their clarity even as the underlying tensions intensify, setting the stage for a future in which identity itself will become a contested terrain, and where the question of who belongs, who governs, and by what right will no longer be answered by tradition alone, but will instead become the central, unresolved conflict driving the centuries ahead. As the 14th century unfolds, the fragile architecture of Anglo-Norman control, so carefully extended across Ireland in the previous century, begins not to shatter all at once, but to erode in uneven, almost imperceptible stages, as if the island itself were quietly reclaiming ground that had never been fully surrendered. And this erosion is driven not solely by rebellion or resistance, but by a convergence of pressures, environmental, political, and demographic, that together undermine the ability of external authority to sustain itself, beginning with the destabilizing impact of broader European crises, such as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which weakens populations already living at the edge of subsistence, and later the arrival of the Black Death, whose silent, indiscriminate advance empties towns, disrupts trade, and fractures the very networks upon which Norman governance depends, leaving behind not only loss of life, but a vacuum of control that no centralized authority is positioned to fill. In this vacuum, something older and more deeply rooted begins to re-emerge, not as a simple restoration of the past, but as a reassertion of systems that had never truly disappeared, as Gaelic lordships expand outward once again, reclaiming territories that had fallen under Anglo-Norman influence, while many of the Norman families themselves, cut off from consistent support from England and increasingly embedded within the local landscape, begin to undergo a transformation so profound that later observers will describe them as becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, adopting language, customs, dress, and systems of kinship that align them less with the distant authority of the English crown, and more with the immediate realities of survival and power within Ireland's shifting internal dynamics, creating a cultural convergence that blurs distinctions even as it complicates loyalties. And yet, this resurgence of Gaelic influence does not produce unity, nor does it restore a stable equilibrium, because the same patterns of fragmentation that defined earlier centuries reassert themselves with renewed intensity. As rival clans compete for dominance, as alliances shift rapidly in response to opportunity and threat, and as the very absence of strong, centralized control allows local conflicts to expand unchecked, creating a landscape in which authority is once again localized, negotiated, and often violently contested, while beyond Ireland, the English crown, increasingly preoccupied with its own internal struggles and continental ambitions, allows its influence over the island to contract into a more limited zone of direct control, centered primarily around the Pale, a region surrounding Dublin, which becomes less a symbol of dominance and more a defensive enclave. A shrinking perimeter within which English law and identity are actively maintained against the surrounding resurgence of Gaelic power. By the close of the 14th century, Ireland has not reverted to what it once was, nor has it progressed into a unified colonial territory, but instead exists in a state of layered regression and transformation, where the ambitions of the previous century have receded, where the boundaries between cultures have blurred even further, and where the island's political reality is once again defined less by imposed structure and more by internal motion, setting the stage for a future in which external powers will attempt, with increasing force and determination, to reassert control, but will do so against a landscape that has proven, time and again, resistant to permanence, resistant to simplification, and deeply capable of reshaping whatever is imposed upon it into something uniquely its own. As the 15th century unfolds, Ireland exists in a state that appears, at first glance, almost cyclical, as though the centuries of Norman expansion and subsequent retreat have resolved into a familiar pattern of localized rule, shifting alliances, and regional dominance. But beneath this apparent return to form lies a far more complex and quietly unstable reality, because what has emerged is not a restoration of the pre-invasion Gaelic order, but rather a hybrid landscape in which identities have blended, political structures have adapted, and the very meaning of power has become increasingly ambiguous, with Anglo-Norman descendants, now often referred to as the Old English, embedded so deeply within Irish society that distinctions between native and settler have begun to dissolve in practice, even as they remain politically significant in theory, creating a society that is at once interconnected and internally divided, unified by proximity, yet fractured by lineage and allegiance. Within this landscape, Gaelic lordships regain prominence across much of the island, operating through systems of kinship, tribute, and customary law that continue to function with remarkable resilience, while the English crown's authority contracts further into the defensive boundaries of the Pale surrounding Dublin, where governance becomes less about expansion and more about preservation, an effort to maintain a foothold of English identity and legal structure in a territory that increasingly operates beyond its effective control. And yet, even here, within this nominal center of authority, the lines are not clean, because many of those who live within the Pale share cultural and familial ties with those beyond it, creating a porous boundary that resists strict enforcement and reflects the deeper entanglement of the island's communities. At the same time, power within Ireland becomes increasingly decentralized, concentrated in the hands of dominant regional families, both Gaelic and Old English, whose influence extends across territories that function almost as independent realms, engaging in diplomacy, warfare, and internal governance with limited reference to any overarching authority. While the English monarchy, preoccupied with its own dynastic conflicts, such as the Wars of the Roses, lacks both the capacity and the immediate incentive to reassert direct control over Ireland, thereby allowing this semi-autonomous system to persist and evolve, even as it becomes more entrenched and, in some respects, more resistant to external intervention. And yet, for all its apparent stability, this arrangement contains within it the seeds of future disruption, because the very hybridity that allows it to function, this blending of Gaelic and Old English identities, this coexistence of differing legal and political systems, this decentralized distribution of power, also creates a landscape that is difficult to govern from the outside, a landscape that resists uniformity and invites intervention precisely because it lacks a single, unified structure, so that as the century draws to a close and a new era of more assertive, centralized monarchy begins to take shape in England, Ireland stands poised at the threshold of a transformation it does not yet fully anticipate, a transformation that will seek not merely to influence or participate in its systems, but to fundamentally reorder them, imposing new definitions of authority, land ownership, and identity that will reverberate across the centuries to come. As the 16th century begins, Ireland, long suspended in a state of negotiated autonomy, cultural blending, and decentralized authority, enters a phase in which the distant presence of English power transforms into something far more deliberate, systematic, and unyielding, as the Tudor monarchy, emerging from its own internal consolidation, turns its attention westward with a clarity of purpose that had been absent in previous centuries, seeking not merely to influence Ireland through alliances or partial control, but to fully integrate it into a centralized state structure, thereby redefining the island not as a frontier or a patchwork of semi-independent lordships, but as a governed territory subject to uniform law, administration, and, increasingly, ideological alignment. This transformation is initiated under Henry VIII, whose break from the authority of the Catholic Church in Rome does not remain confined to England, but extends outward into Ireland, where it introduces a new and destabilizing dimension to an already complex political landscape, as religious affiliation becomes intertwined with questions of loyalty and governance, and where the policy of surrender and re-grant seeks to convert Gaelic lords into subjects of the crown by offering them recognition of their lands under English law in exchange for submission, a process that, while superficially conciliatory, fundamentally alters the basis of authority by replacing traditional systems of kinship and customary law with a hierarchical crown-centered model that demands not only political allegiance, but cultural and administrative transformation. Yet, as the century progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that these efforts at integration will not proceed smoothly, because the imposition of centralized control encounters resistance at multiple levels: cultural, political, and religious, particularly as the English state intensifies its efforts under rulers such as Elizabeth I, whose reign is marked by a more aggressive strategy of military intervention, plantation, and suppression, culminating in a series of escalating conflicts that reach their most dramatic expression in the 9 Years' War, where powerful Gaelic leaders, most notably Hugh O'Neill, mount a sustained and sophisticated resistance against English forces, drawing upon both traditional structures and emerging alliances to challenge the expansion of crown authority in a conflict that transforms large portions of the island into a contested and militarized landscape. What distinguishes this century from those that came before is not merely the presence of conflict, which has always been a constant in Ireland's history, but the scale and intent behind it, as the English state increasingly moves from a position of intermittent influence to one of systematic transformation, seeking to dismantle the hybrid, decentralized order that had defined the island for generations and replace it with a uniform structure aligned with its own political, legal, and religious frameworks, a process that does not simply alter governance, but begins to reshape identity itself, dividing communities along lines that will harden over time, embedding tensions that extend far beyond the immediate conflicts of the 16th century. And so, as the year 1600 approaches, Ireland stands at a threshold far more consequential than any it has yet encountered. Its older systems under sustained pressure, its hybrid identities strained by external demands for conformity, and its landscape marked by both resistance and transformation, signaling the end of one historical rhythm and the beginning of another, one in which the forces acting upon the island will grow more centralized, more intrusive, and more enduring, setting the stage for a century that will not merely continue these processes, but accelerate them to a point of irreversible change. As the 17th century begins, the conflicts that define the closing years of the previous era do not fade into resolution, but instead harden into something far more decisive, as the defeat of Gaelic resistance in the aftermath of the 9 Years' War marks not merely the end of a military campaign, but the collapse of an entire political order, a collapse made unmistakably visible in events such as the flight of the Earls, when leading figures of the old Gaelic aristocracy depart Ireland, leaving behind a vacuum that is not filled organically, but deliberately, systematically, and with a clarity of purpose that signals a fundamental shift in how the island will be governed as the English crown moves to replace the fluid, kinship-based structures of landholding with a fixed, surveyed, and redistributed landscape aligned with its own political and economic interests. This transformation finds its most consequential expression in the plantation of Ulster, where vast tracts of land are confiscated and redistributed to English and Scottish settlers, not simply as a matter of economic development, but as a deliberate strategy of control, embedding a new population whose allegiance is expected to align with the crown, and in doing so, altering not only patterns of ownership, but the demographic and cultural composition of entire regions, creating settlements defined by new architectural forms, agricultural practices, and religious affiliations, while the displaced Gaelic population is pushed to the margins, both physically and politically, generating a landscape in which coexistence is structured by inequality and tension rather than integration. Yet, if plantation represents one axis of transformation, it is accompanied and intensified by a cycle of rebellion and suppression that reveals just how unstable this imposed order remains, as seen in the eruption of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, a conflict that begins as a localized uprising but rapidly expands into a broader and more chaotic struggle, marked by violence, reprisals, and competing narratives of legitimacy, and which, in turn, draws Ireland into the wider conflicts of the British Isles, culminating in the brutal campaigns of Oliver Cromwell, whose arrival in Ireland in 1649 initiates a campaign characterized by sieges, massacres, and the systematic dismantling of resistance, leaving behind not only military defeat, but a reshaped social and political order enforced through confiscation, redistribution, and the imposition of new legal structures. By the latter part of the century, these transformations deepen further, through events such as the Williamite War in Ireland, where Ireland once again becomes a battleground for larger political struggles, culminating in the victory of forces aligned with William III of England and the subsequent consolidation of Protestant ascendancy, a system that entrenches political, economic, and religious power in the hands of a minority, formalizing divisions that had been emerging throughout the century and embedding them into the very structure of governance, land ownership, and identity. And so, as 1700 approaches, Ireland has been transformed more radically than at any previous point in this thousand-year journey. Its landscape surveyed and redistributed, its population reconfigured, its systems of authority replaced or subordinated, and its social fabric redefined along lines that will not easily be undone, creating a new reality in which the question is no longer whether external power will shape the island, but how deeply and how permanently it has already done so, leaving behind a legacy of division, displacement, and contested identity that will echo across the centuries that follow. As the 18th century settles over Ireland, the transformations of the previous 100 years do not dissipate, but instead crystallize into a structured and deeply unequal order, one that presents itself outwardly as stability, predictable, administratively coherent, and aligned with the broader interests of the British state. Yet beneath this surface lies a society stratified with extraordinary rigidity, defined by the dominance of a Protestant ruling class, whose authority is reinforced through a dense network of laws, land ownership patterns, and institutional control, collectively remembered as the era of the Protestant ascendancy, within which political power, economic opportunity, and legal privilege are concentrated in the hands of a relatively small minority, while the majority Catholic population is systematically constrained through measures such as the penal laws, which limit not only land ownership and political participation, but also education, religious practice, and the transmission of wealth, creating a society in which inequality is not incidental, but deliberately engineered. And yet, even within this system of constraint, pressures begin to build, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but steadily accumulating, as economic realities, intellectual currents, and external influences begin to challenge the permanence of the established order, particularly in urban centers such as Dublin, where elements of cultural and intellectual life flourish in ways that both reflect and complicate the island's political structure, giving rise to a paradoxical environment in which Ireland can simultaneously produce significant contributions to literature, philosophy, and political thought, while maintaining a deeply exclusionary social system, and where the influence of broader Enlightenment ideas circulating across Europe and the Atlantic world begins to interact with local grievances, gradually reshaping how authority, rights, and governance are understood. These tensions find increasingly explicit expression toward the latter part of the century, as movements advocating for reform and greater autonomy begin to take shape, drawing upon both local conditions and international developments, most notably the influence of revolutionary movements abroad, culminating in the emergence of groups such as the United Irishmen and the eventual eruption of the Irish Rebellion of 1798, an event that represents not only a direct challenge to British authority, but also a moment in which the possibility of a different Ireland, one defined less by sectarian division and more by shared political identity, is briefly, though dramatically articulated, even as the rebellion itself is met with suppression, fragmentation, and ultimately failure. By the time the century draws to a close, the apparent stability of the ascendancy has been revealed as something far more precarious. its authority maintained through control rather than consensus, its structures increasingly challenged by both internal dissatisfaction and external ideological currents, and its future uncertain in ways that would have been difficult to imagine at the beginning of the century, setting the stage for a profound political reconfiguration that will arrive in the years immediately ahead, reshaping not only Ireland's relationship with Britain, but also the internal dynamics of power, identity, and resistance that have been building, quietly but persistently, beneath the surface of 18th century life. As the 19th century begins, Ireland is drawn fully into a new constitutional reality through the Act of Union 1800, an arrangement that dissolves its separate parliament and integrates the island directly into the political structure of the United Kingdom, a shift presented as a stabilizing measure in the aftermath of rebellion, but experienced by many as a further removal of local agency, as decisions affecting Irish land, economy, and governance become increasingly centralized in distant institutions, even as the underlying social structure, defined by concentrated land ownership, widespread tenancy, and deep economic vulnerability, remains largely unchanged, creating a condition in which political integration does not resolve existing tensions, but instead overlays them with a new layer of administrative distance. It is within this fragile and imbalanced system that the most devastating event of the century unfolds: the Great Famine, a catastrophe that cannot be understood solely as a failure of crops, but rather as the convergence of ecological dependency, economic structure, and political response, where the blight that destroys the potato harvest strikes at the foundation of subsistence for millions, while existing systems of land ownership and export-oriented agriculture continue to operate, producing a scenario in which food exists within the island yet remains inaccessible to those who need it most, leading to mass starvation, disease, and a scale of suffering that reshapes not only the population but the collective memory of the nation. As entire communities vanish, landscapes are emptied, and the silence left behind becomes as much a part of Ireland's identity as the lives that were lost. From this devastation emerges not recovery in any immediate sense, but dispersal, as emigration becomes not an exception, but a defining feature of Irish life, with millions leaving the island for destinations across the Atlantic and beyond, carrying with them not only the necessity of survival, but the cultural imprint of a homeland marked by loss and resilience, creating a global Irish diaspora that extends the boundaries of the nation far beyond its geographic limits. While within Ireland itself, the latter half of the century is shaped by movements seeking to address the conditions that made such catastrophe possible, including campaigns for land reform and political autonomy, led by figures such as Charles Stewart Parnell, whose efforts to challenge landlordism and advocate for home rule signal a shift toward organized mass political action as a means of redefining Ireland's future. And yet, even as these movements gain momentum, the century closes without resolution, leaving Ireland suspended between transformation and continuation. Its population diminished, yet globally expanded, its political aspirations increasingly articulated, yet not fully realized, and its social structure altered, but not entirely reformed, so that the legacy of the 19th century is not a single outcome, but a set of conditions, demographic, economic, and political, that will carry forward into the next era, shaping the struggles, conflicts, and redefinitions that will ultimately determine the island's path into modernity. As the 20th century begins, Ireland carries forward the unresolved tensions of the previous era. Political aspirations intensified but unfulfilled, social structures altered yet still unequal, and a population both diminished at home and expanded across the world, creating a landscape primed not for gradual reform, but for rupture, as movements advocating for self-governance evolve into something more immediate and confrontational, culminating first in the symbolic yet profoundly consequential Subicia of the Easter Rising, where a relatively small group of insurgents seize key positions in Dublin and declare an independent republic, an act that, though militarily unsuccessful, transforms public perception and political momentum, converting a failed rebellion into a catalyst for broader national awakening, as executions and reprisals reshape sympathy and harden resolve. This shift accelerates into the Irish War of Independence, a guerrilla conflict that transforms Ireland into a landscape of ambushes, reprisals, and fragmented authority, where conventional military structures give way to localized, asymmetric strategies, and where political legitimacy is contested not only through armed struggle, but through parallel systems of governance that challenge British control, ultimately leading to negotiations that produce the Anglo-Irish Treaty, an agreement that simultaneously achieves partial independence while embedding a division within the island itself, formalized through the partition of Ireland into the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland, a division that reflects not only political compromise, but deeply rooted differences in identity, allegiance, and historical experience. Yet, rather than resolving tensions, this partition gives rise to new conflicts, most immediately in the form of the Irish Civil War, where former allies turn against one another over the terms of the treaty, embedding a legacy of internal division within the newly formed state, while in Northern Ireland, the establishment of a separate political entity creates a system in which sectarian divisions become institutionalized, setting the stage for decades of unrest that will later erupt into the period known as the Troubles, a prolonged conflict marked by violence, political deadlock, and competing narratives of legitimacy, before gradually giving way, toward the end of the century, to efforts at negotiation and reconciliation, exemplified by agreements such as the Good Friday Agreement, which, while not erasing divisions, establishes a framework for coexistence and political cooperation. Across this century, Ireland does not move in a straight line from subjugation to independence, nor from conflict to resolution, but instead navigates a series of overlapping transformations, political, social, economic, that reshape the island in ways both profound and incomplete, as the Republic of Ireland emerges as a sovereign state while continuing to negotiate its identity in relation to its past, its diaspora, and its changing role in a globalized world, and as Northern Ireland remains a site where history is not simply remembered, but actively lived, contested, and reinterpreted, so that by the year 2000, Ireland exists not as a finished story, but as a complex and evolving reality, shaped by 1,000 years of continuity and disruption, resilience and fracture, memory and reinvention, its future still unfolding, its past never entirely at rest.